Welcome students. In this session, we shall discuss Plato's ideas regarding his ideal state. Before entering into this discussion, we need to become aware of the political background in which Plato had the vision of his ideal state in the first place. We are perhaps aware of the fact that Plato was born in Athens, one of the most illustrious, one of the strongest, and one of the most developed city-states of the Greek kingdom. Plato was in his early youth when Athens entered into a 3-decade-long war with one of its neighbors, Sparta. This war has gone down in history as the Peloponnesian War. During the course of this war, Athens was faced with absolute economic, political, and cultural ruination. What came to be known as the golden age of Athenian democracy under the rule of Pericles was in its last legs, and Plato unfortunately had to witness the downfall of his beloved motherland. It becomes obvious then to us that he would try to envision a state which could withstand the ravages of time, of military attacks externally, of internally disintegrating economic or political systems. Thus, egged on, we will turn to the pages of the Republic, which is one of Plato's finest works and which was written between 380 and 370 BC. This work was written in the form of a dialogue, and this method Plato had borrowed from his mentor, Socrates. Now, Gettel has identified 3 very important first principles of the Republic. That's what he calls them. By first principles, what I mean is the most important principles that Plato enunciates in his book, The Republic, which helps us to attain a greater and a better understanding of this great political thinker. Firstly, Plato emphasizes upon the Socratic Maxim, virtue is knowledge. He acknowledges that it is knowledge which can lead to good, and good has an objective, independent existence and can be realized by those who possess the capability of acquiring the good through knowledge. The second very important principle of the Republic is that men vary or differ from one another in terms of capabilities, aptitudes, skill, and disposition. Now, if I link the second point to the first point, it becomes obvious that good can be recognized, but cannot be recognized or attained by all men equally. Since men are intrinsically different, they differ from each other in their capabilities of attaining good by attaining knowledge. Thus, some men would be more capable of attaining knowledge and therefore good, whereas there would be others in society who would not be so very capable of acquiring good and knowledge. The third important principle that has been identified in the Republic by Gettel is happiness of the individual can be found when an individual subjects himself to a higher order. What is meant by higher order? Higher order simply refers to a state of excellence wherein I agree to subject myself, my words, my deeds to the direction, guidance, or maybe even control of someone I consider to be better than myself. Having subjected oneself to a higher order, one enables the best possible development of one's capabilities and skills and aptitudes. By identifying good as the most desirable virtue, or something which can lead to the betterment of society at large, Plato basically tries to create an aristocracy of intelligence. What exactly is meant by aristocracy of intelligence? We need to follow a simple order here. Firstly, Plato says that it is knowledge which helps one to attain good with a capital G. Knowledge is something which is not universally available in the same amount across people belonging to all social strata. Knowledge is almost exclusively available in the very few who belong to the highest rung of society. Since this rung possess knowledge, they automatically have access to good. Having access to good enables them to rule society according to such laws and principles which would enable the society to become successful, developed, and flourishing. This is what Plato means by an aristocracy of intelligence. By aristocracy, we refer to rule by a small group of people. Here, the small group of people who are ruling do not rule on the basis of their superiority of arms or on the basis of their superiority of power or money, but because they are superior to the others in terms of intelligence or knowledge. After establishing these important principles in the Republic, Plato says, or rather reminds us, that the state is not just a political organization, rather it is an organization based on the mutual cooperation of all individuals who are by nature social, therefore gregarious, therefore need the active cooperation of others in order to satisfy their own needs. Secondly, an ideal state, or rather Plato's ideal state, would have to be characterized by justice. Justice would be found in a state where the tripartite division of the soul would enable the tripartite division of society. As in, according to the theory of three souls and three classes, Plato identified three dominant virtues in the human soul. The first virtue identified by Plato was wisdom. Wisdom automatically entailed the virtue of knowledge, and this category of people who possessed wisdom and knowledge was thought by Plato to be the ones who are most capable of ruling. He calls this class of people his Philosopher Kings. The second class of Platonic Ideal State or society comprises of the auxiliaries or the soldiers who possess spirit and bravery. They are by disposition more likely to be courageous and physically stronger than the rest of society, and more likely to dedicate themselves to the protection of the rest of society. The third rung of society, as identified by Plato, were the producers or the artisan classes. The farmers, the artisans, all those people engaging in producing certain goods and providing certain services which would help the rest of society to sustain themselves physically and materially. This correspondence between the quality of the soul, virtue of the individual, and social class has been termed as Plato's theory of justice. Once this tripartite division of society is enabled or established, Plato moves into a discussion of his ruling class. Very interestingly, Plato calls his rulers Philosopher Kings. Sounds more like an oxymoron, a contradiction in itself, because philosophers are supposed to be individuals who seek truth, knowledge, wisdom. Rulers, on the other hand, are a category of people who are known to seek power, and perhaps more power than that. When Plato places these two terms together, what he tries to arrive at is that he would like his ideal state to be ruled by such men who do not crave for power, who do not lust after the empires of other kings, but who, like philosophers, have engaged in a lifelong search for truth. When they have arrived at the truth or the ultimate knowledge or the knowledge of the ultimate good, they have decided that they shall dedicate their lives to the betterment of society and the attainment of the common good of all. That is why Plato uses the term philosopher kings. Now, how exactly were these philosopher kings to be found out in society? Who would decide who was capable of becoming philosopher kings? Here we come into contact, or we become aware of Plato's ingenuity, because he devises a scheme of education which is till date known as one of the best schemes of education ever devised by any man till date. Plato's scheme of education is not exclusively for the philosopher kings, nor for the soldiers, nor for the common people. His scheme of education is one which encompasses all people living in a city-state. All people, including women, and that is a very important point over here, and belonging to all strata of society, all the three strata that he has mentioned in his scheme of society, all people from the age of their infancy would be introduced into the same mode of education, same age, they would be exposed to the same sort of curricula, and by a process of selective elimination, only on the basis of a test of excellence, could finally the philosopher kings be sieved out of a particular generation of students. Now, how exactly does Plato go about conducting this scheme of education? He says that from the age of infancy, like 4 or 5 years, till the age of 20, all children in this age group would be subjected to a two-part education scheme. One part of the education would cater to the needs of the mind. Herein, the children would be taught music, literature, different kinds of poetry, drama, and anything that could be brought under the broad label of literature. The second part of this very scheme or time frame of education would include gymnastics. This would cater to the needs of the developing body of people belonging to this particular age group. Now, once the students had gone through this particular time frame of 0 to 20 years, wherein their minds and bodies were adequately trained, they would have to face an examination. Those who qualified this particular stage of examination would move on to studying arithmetic, logic, and astronomy for the next 10 years. Once again, at the end of these 10 years, there would be a process of elimination, more in the form of an examination. Once again, only those who would qualify this particular round of examination would move on to the next stage of education, which would last for the next 5 years. In these 5 years, when an individual was aged between 30 and 35, he or she would be made to study philosophy and dialectical thinking. This was one of the most crucial stages in Plato's scheme of education, which would help to judge whether an individual was fitted to becoming a philosopher king or not. At the end of this particular stage, yet another examination would be conducted, during which it would be decided that only the very best of students could qualify into the next round of education. The next round, beginning at the age of 35, would last for the next 15 years. From 35 to 50, those very few students who had qualified would be trained in the art of governance and warfare. Those who finally stayed put after the age of 50 would be safely assumed that they are perhaps the best suited to become the next Philosopher Kings? And finally, at the age of 50, would they assume the role of rulers of their specific city-state? It is to be taken into consideration that such a rigorous process of education, training, and disciplining would definitely have very few students who would last till the very last age. And that would ensure that only the best among a particular generation of individuals remained to be appointed as the Philosopher Kings. Now, once appointed as the Philosopher Kings, Plato takes his theory of the ideal state a stage further and says that he wants to distinguish between the rulers of his ideal state and the rulers of any other ordinary kingdom that we are more aware with or more familiar with. He wants to eliminate all sorts of corruptions or temptations that usually lie in the path of those who possess power and exercise power. Here, he devises a very unique scheme to keep his Philosopher Kings immune from all such corruptions and temptations. This scheme of Plato is known as the communism of wives and property. A very interesting point is made over here. Plato believes that private family and private property are at the source of all corruption in society. He believes that it is because of filial bonds of love and care that people fall into the trap of corruption, misuse power, abuse position, and generally indulge in immoral activities. Now, if Plato's Philosopher Kings were to be kept immune from all sorts of sins and temptations, then they could not have any private families. Thus, Plato's Philosopher Kings and Queens had no right to marry. They had no right to have children who they would know as their children, their own children. And automatically, in the absence of any family, the Philosopher King or Queen would not feel the need for having any private property simply because he or she would not have anybody to pass his property on to. The Philosopher Kings and Queens would live together in common barracks like soldiers do when the war is not on. They would eat at common tables. They would have no private land, no sort of private property, not even jewels or anything precious to which even a figment of attachment could be identified. And during a particular period of the year, the best quality Philosopher Kings and Philosopher Queens would be allowed to mate with each other, much like what we find in the animal kingdom, in dogs and cats, etc., where the best of the breed are made to breed with each other or mate with each other so that the best quality offsprings can be born. Much in the same fashion, the best of the Philosopher Kings and Queens would be allowed to mate with each other. The children born of such unions would be taken away immediately by the state, and the children would not know who their birth parents were. Neither would the birth parents ever find out who their own children were, thus eliminating all possibilities of filial ties, therefore obligations or responsibilities, and therefore corruption. So no private land, no private property, and therefore the possibility of placing Philosopher Kings and Queens above all temptations of corruption and selfishness. Now, once an individual, a Philosopher King or Queen, is devoid of any personal relations or any personal ties, his only tie is with the truth, with wisdom, with knowledge of the highest good possible, and therefore he or she would dedicate himself completely to the betterment of the city-state that he was ruling. He would help to guide that city-state to the attainment of its highest possible good. having become aware of Plato's notion regarding the communism of wives and property for his Philosopher Kings, it would almost make us feel that the power that Plato wanted his Philosopher Kings to enjoy was absolute in every sense of the term. However, that is not so. There are certain limitations upon the philosophic absolutism of the Philosopher Kings of Plato too. What are these limitations? Firstly, the Philosopher Kings were bound to maintain the size of the city-state so that it was neither too small to be unproductive nor too big to be unmanageable. Secondly, the Philosopher Kings were also bound to minimize the gap between the rich and the poor. Thirdly, they had to maintain the scheme of education as Plato had created the scheme, and they had to ensure that education was never delivered by private individuals. The education as deemed fit by Plato was such that it could not be delivered properly and done justice to by any private enterprise. It would have to be the state, or rather the Philosopher Kings, who would maintain Plato's scheme of education in all its sanctity in order to serve its purpose. And lastly, the Philosopher Kings were bound to frame such laws which would keep the Platonic principles of justice in mind. With this, we come to the end of this particular discussion or this section of discussion regarding the Platonic ideal state. It goes without saying that as in other areas of social studies, this particular area of political thought too is not without its fair share of criticisms. Firstly, Plato himself realized that the ideal state that he had conceptualized was absolutely impracticable. In reality, it would not be possible to find out Philosopher Kings who would rule with philosophical ideas in their mind, specifically when they would have unlimited powers in their hands. As the age-old saying goes, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when Plato believes that the Philosopher Kings, because they have no private interests or private ties, would never misuse or abuse power, that would be too much of an utopian kind of an assumption. There was no guarantee that his Philosopher Kings, simply because they were enlightened or educated or knowledgeable persons, would never abuse power. Therefore, in another one of his very famous works, a book known as The Laws, this book is Plato's one of the last written books by Plato, and it is also a book which is written in the dialogue form. Plato identifies his second best state. In his second best state, Plato tries to shift the means through which the highest common good could be acquired. We have to keep in mind that, of course, Plato's ideal state would still want to achieve the highest good of the entire society, but this time the means would not be some utopian or philosophical category of rulers, but this time he tries to do so through establishing rule of law. By creating a body of laws which were just in their inception and applicability, Plato wanted to establish a society which would almost actualize itself to the ideal state of being. Thank you.